So in one moment we read for the morning of Rosh Hashanah this iconic passage in the Torah. Goes by the name of the Akedah. Akedah means the binding. Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. Many of us, when we were young, we mistakenly were told it was the sacrifice of Isaac. It's not the sacrifice of Isaac. As you know, the end of the story, Isaac is not sacrificed. The Hebrew is Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And we read it every single Rosh Hashanah morning, and again in synagogues all over the world, either on the first or second day of Rosh Hashanah. This is the reading that is being done. And every now and then, I shouldn't say every now and then, very, very, very often, you will hear Jews say it's the most upsetting passage in the entire Torah. Why? Because in the Torah, the story begins with God testing Abraham by asking Abraham to take his son, his only son, the one he loves, to a mountain where he will show him. And there he's asking Abraham to sacrifice his child, his son, to kill his son as a test of some kind of loyalty and fidelity to God. And when many Jews today read that passage, there's nothing about it that seems to be in keeping with our understanding of what the Jewish tradition teaches about life and family and children or God. And so there's an immediate negative reaction to the story. There are some people who think the story should be taken out of the Torah entirely. As we know, chapter 22 of the book of Genesis. And so we have spent 40-some years looking at this passage and trying to understand that, in fact, it is a spectacular passage of the Torah. It may be the most brilliant, wonderful, important, positive chapter in the entire Torah. There are so many wonderful stories in the Torah, and it's so easy to say when everyone is reading whatever story, whatever passage, whatever sedra, that's the most important. But in many ways, just the reality of human life, the Akedah is the most important human chapter in the entire book, because because it's revolutionary. The Akedah story is revolutionary in the best sense of the word. It is revolutionary. And my juices just go crazy when I have an opportunity to talk about the Akedah to anybody who doesn't get it. And every year I hope, well, maybe I'll say it in a way everybody will get it. And I think there are many, many, many people in this room, for all I know, you already get it, and who am I talking to? And so we'll just take a couple quick steps, and then I'll show you why it's so important. But step number one. Here we are at a Jewish service. We did liturgy. Anybody who comes to this service knows this is not a service long on liturgy. If you've ever been to a traditional service, and when I mean traditional, I mean you go to a Reform synagogue, you go to a conservative synagogue, you go to an Orthodox synagogue. Liturgy is prayers. The prayers are forever. And if you're with the Chavurot, there is I want to try to find the right words to say this right. We pay respect. If somebody says to me, what are you doing in the first half hour of your service in the Chavurot? We are paying respect to a tradition where there was a liturgy, a prayer service that for many Jews, it was all the high holidays were. When my brother and I were kids growing up in Connecticut, we would go with our parents to services. First of all, it was all about what suit we would get and how we would look. And then we would come in and we would sit, and it was just hell. It would never end. And the cantor just couldn't sing without singing it again and again, and the notes and the words. Let's go. And I remember, I don't know if it's, for all I know, by the way, it's true here. You know, I'm up here, I have no idea what you're thinking, and I've said to you before, somebody said, Mark, you haven't been well. You can make the service shorter. And I knew what they were saying is, please make it shorter. And no rabbi can ever make the service short enough. It's impossible. And I once said to you, and I believe it's absolutely true, if you came in and the rabbi simply said, Shabbat Shalom, let's go home. Somebody would say to somebody else, you see how long it took him to say Shabbat Shalom? I understand, And I remember sitting there and all I would do was look, how many pages left? How many pages left? And we're only on 352. We have to get to 498. It's not who I am. It's not who I think most of the people in this Chavurot. What I say to myself is, if there are people here who really love the liturgy, they wouldn't come here. They would go to a service where that piece of them would be fulfilled. So I'm assuming the reason that people are here is whatever we do liturgically, if anything, it's too much, but if it's not too much, nobody's upset. But it's very little. And I've had Orthodox Jews say to me, your service is very lovely. It's just, I blinked and that was it. And it reflects my view of what really the rabbinic, when the rabbinic tradition says that the most important thing you can do is study, not pray. And study is supposed to lead to how you live your life and how you behave. It's all about how you treat other people, and you do that through study. And the Jewish tradition says if you have a choice between study and prayer, you're to study, not pray. And there's so many midrash in the Jewish tradition where God is saying something like, if they would only just forget about me and care about each other. That's Jewish. And at one time, people lived in a very different world where they really believed there was a physical, invisible presence of a God with power to wreak havoc and bestow goodness, to make it rain, to give crops, to make life grow, to heal. And that was the way in which everybody looked at the world. It wasn't just the Jews. That was the way people looked at the world. And any of us who've studied at all ancient civilizations, we know how some of the great civilizations of the world, the Greeks and the Romans, let alone all these other little Hittites and Perizzites and Moabites, and the great civilizations, they all had these pantheons of gods. And so much of your time as a human being was to propitiate. That's the technical word. Propitiate is a way of saying, just make them happy. Keep God happy. Because the way in which you experience the world was you are at the whim of a powerful God or series of gods who can do terrible things to you. And so much of your life is making nice to this ultimate power. And we understand it in human terms as well. Sometimes we're dealing with people who have power over us. We try to be nice to them. At the DMV, for example. Or that type of situation. And, you never want to go afoul of the government. Yes, sir, yes, sir. But here it was God, And so what's surprising to us? And remember, I keep reminding myself, who were these? Where did these people live? They didn't know about gravity. There hadn't been there was no Isaac Newton yet. There was no Galileo. They really believed the world was flat and that the sun revolved around the earth. They believed that in their heart. They didn't know about indoor plumbing. They didn't know about electricity. Not one of them had an iPhone. And it's something we take for granted. There was no internet, no computer. More, there was no vaccine. There was no antibiotic. There was no anesthetic. No one understood what hygiene meant. The world was so primitive. What's remarkable is that anything the rabbis get right is just shocking. And we talked about it last night. What they got right was human nature. Human nature. So they taught, listen, this is what you do. If you do something wrong, take a bull or a sheep or a dove, bring it to the temple and kill it. Burn it, and God will be happy. You will say you're sorry to God by killing a little bird or a sheep. And then after the temple was destroyed, the rabbinic genius figured out a way that you could still keep God happy. It was called prayer. So for every sacrifice, they created a service. By the way, when I was growing up, I never could understand why this is called a service. We're going to services. What does that mean? Because it's the English translation of the word avodah. Avodah was what you did in the temple. You served in the temple. Comes from the word eved. It comes from the word slave and servant. You went and you served. How did you serve? You killed animals. And so the rabbi said, no, we won't kill animals anymore. There will be a sacrifice of the heart. And we'll do it with prayer. We'll have services of prayer. And for every service where we would have killed an animal, we'll now have a prayer service. So you used to have to kill animals 3 times a day, so now Jews pray 3 times a day. And there's a special sacrifice for Rosh Hashanah. We'll have a special service for Rosh Hashanah. And don't get me wrong, I'm not belittling it or ridiculing it. I'm only saying we should put it in perspective. And for most of us, and I say this with enormous humility, I have no right, I don't want to tell anybody in this room what they do or do not believe in God, don't believe in God. What you believe about God is your business. And when I talk, sometimes I feel afterward, people may have thought I was ridiculing anyone in this room who believes in a more fundamentalist view of God. It's not my place. Nobody should tell anybody else how they should imagine God, relate to God, think of God. That's such a personal thing. But I'm assuming, and just in humility, I'm assuming that most of the people in this room don't believe in a fundamentalist view of God, that somehow God is an invisible, conscious power who is somehow involved in our life, and if you pray to this power, something good will happen, and if you don't pray to this power, something bad will happen. And I've tried to argue over the years that I don't believe that's what the Jewish tradition ever tried to say to us. The Jewish tradition does not believe in an invisible person called God. And when the Jewish tradition says you can never see God, they don't mean you can't see him with your eyes. It's the Jewish tradition trying to say the most profound thing about human beings' relationship to whatever is the power of this universe. You can't prove it. No matter what you do, you will never prove there's a God. And if somebody says to me, Mark, do you believe in God? The best answer I can give them is sometimes. Or maybe. And I've said to you before, I find it difficult to understand how somebody could be positive. They're positive there's a God in this world. And I'm also I'm impatient in my own heart with people who say, I know for a fact there is no God. You know? But you're not arrogant, are you? But you know for a fact there is no God. And the reality is, this is what the Jewish tradition teaches, and I'm up against this all the time when I speak to more Orthodox rabbis. The Jewish tradition says, you live with doubt. You live with ambivalence. It's called being human. You're never asked to be sure. And the wonderful thing about a synagogue is, nobody stops you at the door and says, do you believe in God? Then you can come in. Nobody says when you come to the Torah, but understand how important this is. We're going to see people called to the Torah. They're going to come up with their children, their nephews, their granddaughters. They're going to come here, and they're going to say a blessing. Baruch hu et Adonai havarach, Baruch Adonai barach le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, asher bachar banu, v'natan lanu et Torato. They're going to say, there's a God in this world who gave us the Torah. And the question is, do they mean it? And the wisdom of the Jewish tradition is, nobody asks you if you mean it. Just say it. Because by saying it, you connect yourself to a long history and a people. It doesn't matter whether any individual in this room does or does not believe that the Torah was given by God. The question is, how do the Jewish people live? And are we connected as Jewish people? So it's wonderful that there are other traditions, by the way, with catechisms and tests and professions of faith. The Jew has none of it. Only question is, do you show up? If you show up, you're embraced. Period, end. Then work it out yourself. But the community as a whole will sing the Shema. The community as a whole makes a statement about what they want to be. But every individual gets to work it out. Now, why do I say this today? Because I hope you understand. The Akedah story never happened. There is no God in any heaven who said to a father, take your son to a mountain and kill him. There's no Jewish God who said that, ever, ever. And there was no father who had to figure it out, ever. The story, it's a story. It's a poem. It's a prose poem. That's what the Akedah is. And a prose poem has a point. The point is not to tell us what happened that we could see on the 6 o'clock news. It's not a news story. It's not a newspaper event. It's not an event of fact. It's an event of heart. Nothing in the Torah is fact. By the way, the context is there was a Jewish people, and they emanated from a group of people we call Abraham, and they ended up in slavery. That's true. But all the details of the Torah are allegorical, metaphorical. What Maimonides calls a mashal. I didn't make this up. If anybody's saying, oh, this is Reform Judaism and it's Golub. It's not Golub. It's a mashal. That's what Maimonides, the greatest teacher of all Jewish history, calls the Torah. The Torah is a mashal, one mashal after another. The best way to translate mashal is metaphor. It's poetry. And until we understand that this is an exquisite, brilliant poem about our lives, then people struggle with it in the most nonsensical way. If you read the story, the one thing you have to worry about is, how could there be a God who would do? There was no God who did this. And then people will ask this following question, then why read it? Then what's the point? Why do you read? If it isn't true, if it isn't about the real God and the real Abraham, why read it? But you can ask me, why read Old Man in the Sea? Why read Catcher in the Rye? Lahavdil. Why read War and Peace, if anybody reads War and Peace? Why read any great piece of literature? Why hear any piece of music? Music, but for people who love music, there are worlds in that music that touches their soul, that makes them want to do and be. Great art tells us more about ourselves than anything we could read in any newspaper. And so if it's not about a real God, why did Jews read it? Because it's true. For the Jewish people, it's true. The Akedah is true. It's not an event that's true. It's a message that's true, that asks us who we are and who we want to be. We read the Torah because it's our story. By the way, it's our people's story. And every people has a right to their story. There's something magnificent about the Jewish story. It's not the only story, but it's magnificent. We read it because it's ours, because it's brilliant, and because it's true. Not fact, true. And what's true about this story, the Akedah? This is what's true. At the time this book was written, by human beings, not by God at Sinai, by human beings. When this was written, people thought it wasn't about doves and bulls and sheep that we would sacrifice to make God happy. It was our children, especially our firstborn children. Even Israelites were infected with that idolatrous notion that to keep God really happy, you gave him the first fruits of everything, of the field, of the crops, of the herd, and of your children. That was the world in which these people lived. We read from the prophet Micah a moment ago as we took the Torah from the ark, that great passage, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. It's also in the book of Isaiah. My favorite line from Micah, the essence of what it is, this Jewish tradition. Micah says the following: it has been told, O man, what is good and what Adonai requireth thee. You've been told what goodness is and what God in heaven requires of you. You've been told, and this is what you've been told. Simply, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's what you've been told. It is a marvelous summary. The rabbis in the Midrash, they make a big point that you start with 613 commandments, you end with Micah, just 3. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. No one ever quotes the line just before it. I want you to hear the context of what Micah is saying when he says, here's what you do. You live justly, you love mercy, you walk humbly. That's verse 8 of the last chapter of Micah. Here are the lines that precede it. He's asking, he's talking about how people approach God in general in his time, not in the 21st century, in the 7th century, BCE. With what shall I come before Adonai? And how do I bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with 1-year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams or 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Micah is acknowledging that in his time, there were Israelites who thought you pleased God by giving the firstborn fruit of your body. Israelites were just people of their time. And in this time, here comes a story in the most sacred text ever created for the Israelites, the Hebrews, and the Jewish people. And the story says the following: God does not want you to sacrifice your children ever again. Ever again. Don't sacrifice your children. That's not what God wants. And I've said this before, just imagine if you were living in who knows what century BCE, and you thought that one of the things you might have to do is sacrifice your firstborn child, and then you're told that the essence of life, whatever you mean by God, says no, 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 no. You'll never do that again. And the story is rich, the story is complicated, the midrash goes on forever. You know the ultimate midrash I've done almost every single year, where in the end, Abraham calls God to apologize for even suggesting it. Remember, there's no God, there's no event. It's all metaphor and symbolism. And the symbolism is trying to tell people who thought they had to give the first fruits of their body that never again will the Israelites, will the Jewish people sacrifice children. And if somebody says to me, well, why read it today? There is a message that's as real now as it was then. And the question, and it's not just for parents, it starts with parents, but parents become the metaphor of people as a whole. The question we're asked through the Akedah is, do you ever sacrifice your child? Are you doing anything that in essence sacrifices the dignity and the integrity of your own child? I say it starts with parents, but the question is a universal question, because you can do the same thing to anybody that we live with, that we care about, who is in our world. To what extent do we make them an object? To what extent do parents objectify their children? To what extent do parents live vicariously through their own children and take pride in what their children do, not because they're happy for their children, but because it reflects on them? And what they ask of their children is not find who you are, be the most you can be, and we will be there to support you. Whatever choice you make, whatever choice you make. By the way, I'll tell you what choices I hope you make, but in the end, it's your choice. You make your choices. And if you choose something that I wouldn't choose, it doesn't matter. You have an integrity. You have a dignity. And we adore you. Whatever choice you make, how you live your life, where you find your meaning, who you want to live with, how you choose to make a living. It's not about how you wear your hair. It's not about what clothes it's not about what music you listen to. It's about who you are as a person. Whatever you, our child, wants to be as a person, we are there for you. Because we have no right to sacrifice you. We learned that in the Akedah. The Akedah tells us it's not simply about taking a child to a mountain and slaying him. Then you're not reading it as this is meant to be read. The real question is, do you ever do anything that sacrifices the being, the essence, the humanity, the soul of your child? Do you run them with guilt? Do you manipulate them with money? You may not, because they have an integrity and a soul, and they need to be free. And we were told no parent is asked by God to take their child to Moriah. We will not sacrifice our children in any way at all. In any way at all. But it's very hard to do. It's very easy to say. It's very hard to do. This is your child. So many dreams. And every adult knows, oh God, don't make the same mistakes I made. And I'm going to protect you from my mistakes. And we know intellectually you can't ever protect any other person from their own mistakes, your mistakes. It's just, you just hope they navigate life, and you hope you've given your children, a sense of menschlichkeit, that they're good people, and they're doing the best they can. And sometimes they trip, and sometimes they fall, and sometimes it's sad. And there's nothing harder on a parent than an unhappy child. The old line is true, you're only as happy as your unhappiest child. But they have to be given the right to be who they... We can't sacrifice our children on any altar at all. And I was very lucky early on in my life. When Sarit was born, there was no ceremony for a firstborn girl. There were ceremonies for a firstborn boy. It was called Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn son. But there was nothing for girls. And I had a very good friend at the time named Norman Cohen. We were in rabbinical school together. And Norman and I decided we would create a ceremony for girls who were firstborn. In fact, we wanted to make it gender neutral. And we created a ceremony which we called Kiddush Peter Rechem, sanctifying whomever opens the womb, male or female. And we created a very brief liturgy, and it was published in the Central Conference of American Rabbis Journal, and I wrote the theological explanation, and Norman did a lot of the creation of the actual liturgy. And it's a service I use to this day anytime I'm invited to do a baby naming service, whether it's a baby naming or a Pidyon Haben or a Kiddush Peter Rechem. And it always ends with this reading that's read by new parents. This is the way every baby naming service we do ends. Brit Milah for a boy, baby naming for a girl, the parents are there, the grandparents are there, the family is there, it's a lovely, the child's been named, everybody's been blessed. At the very end, the mother and the new father read this. It is the way of parents to care for their children. Yet we would not protect our newborn over much or over long, so that our love becomes a prison from which to escape. So it's in this spirit that we declare to you, and then the name of the newborn child is named. Your existence is your possession, not ours. Out of our love, we care for your life for a little while to help you live and grow. It is our hope and our prayer that we will know when that time is done. For then, with grace and with respect, we must return to you which has been ours only in trust, that which has always been rightfully yours, yourself. That's what new parents say. I once had, she's here today, by the way, I once had a new mother who started reading that, and in the middle she said, "Oh no!" It was so real. The idea that as she brought this child into her life, she already had to be committed to one day letting this child go. But we must be. And why must we be? It's the Akedah. What's the Akedah about? You don't enslave anyone, and you never sacrifice. Certainly not your child, but it's not just about your child. You don't sacrifice your wife or your husband. You don't sacrifice a parent or a grandparent. You don't sacrifice a sibling, a brother or a sister. And you don't sacrifice a friend. You love them. You hug them. And every act of love is an embrace that elevates them to the heavens. And when we're about to read this story, when in the end, the angel says to Abraham, stay your hand. Don't touch a hair on that child. That's the message. It's an extraordinarily beautiful, positive message that we have to hear every year. And if you weren't here last night, this year it's all about the hug. Finding ways to physically embrace someone you care about. To verbally hug by finding beautiful things, uplifting things, things that somehow make them feel better about themselves. Every lovely word spoken to somebody you love is a hug. And finding deeds by which we help others. If you were here last night, you didn't hear the story of the little boy who's trying to move this very, very heavy boulder. And he's pushing, and he's huffing, and he's puffing, he's doing everything he can, and his father is off to the side watching. And at one point the father says to the little boy, are you using all your strength? And the child says, yes. And the father gently says, no, you're not. You haven't asked me for help. Our strength comes through the people who love us. We have to be ready to hug every person we love in this world by being there for them and by offering help. Every time we get a lovely text, every time we get a lovely email, every time we get a lovely phone call, even if it's a message on voicemail, every time somebody comes to see us, and every time somebody puts their arms around us, and somehow through the warmth of their body and the loveliness of their soul, they just make our spirits soar. That's what we're asked to do. And the Akedah makes our spirits soar if we understand what it isn't, and much more what it is. And we all say, Amen.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.